Here, King's Cross Church, and I also have the privilege of serving on the board here at the Hope Center, and so we are really grateful for what this community center represents, and we're committed to it, and we're grateful that you'd spend your is it Wednesday evening with us. I realize this is a sensitive topic that could be provocative in many ways, but I'm really grateful you'd be here. Rachael Denhollander, if you do not know her name, she is a nationally recognized advocate, lawyer, survivor. She became a friend of mine a few years ago when I was learning how to better pastor people through their trauma and abuse, and helping them find healing on the other side of that. And she has become not only a good friend of me, but an advisor to our church and how we process and think about these things. So the format for tonight is very simple and straightforward. Rachel's going to come and talk, and you guys are going to think she's awesome. You're going to have questions for her, and then we're going to do Q&A with her afterwards. After the Q&A, the Q&A will look something along the lines of, you can ask a question from here. I'll pass out the microphone. There's also going to be provided a number if you don't feel comfortable for whatever reason asking your question in a group setting like this, and there's no judgment about any of that. If you want to text a question in, that will come to my phone, and I will read that out for everybody to hear and for Rachel to answer. Also, I'm not going to spam you if you text me. And then at the end of all of this, I'll explain some of the resources that are in the back for anybody interested in those things. So, that being said, there's you. I can't see you through the column. Rachel, thank you for coming and helping us.
All right, is that on? Good? Okay. I'm going to start my timer on my phone because my kids tell me I talk way too long and I need help staying on target. But it really is a privilege to be here with you guys. I think Jacob and I started talking about me coming out a couple of years ago, and then COVID shutdown happened, and 2 years later, here we finally are. So I'm really, really excited to be here with you. I've been so encouraged by the work that the Hope Center has done and that Jacob's Church has been doing from a distance. I want to start by acknowledging tonight that the subject that we're going to be discussing can be really painful, and I want to affirm that you have full agency in this discussion. If anybody needs to step away, to take a moment to leave, please know that I will not be offended by that in the least, and you have my full support and respect if you need to do that. I also want to acknowledge that these discussions can be really difficult, especially for men in the audience, for a couple of reasons. Sometimes it can feel like men are the problem when we're discussing the topic of sexual assault. But the reality in my life is that men have been an incredible healing influence for me. I would not be who I am without my dad and my grandfather and my brother and my husband and incredibly close male friends that helped me through my healing journey. So while we are discussing the issue of sexual assault, I want you to hear that you are the part of the solution, not part of the problem. Real masculinity in all of its strength and integrity and nobility is what we desperately need in this fight. If women could have fixed the issue of sexual assault by ourselves, we would have done it centuries ago. Okay, I want you to hear that you are part of the solution, not part of the problem. I also want to acknowledge up front that this is not just a female problem. Male survivors of sexual assault face very serious hurdles in being able to speak up, and oftentimes when we are discussing these issues, we do it in a way that really neutralizes the male voice and the male survivor experience. And so I want to recognize up front also that this discussion is for all survivors of sexual abuse and trauma, not just females. And what I'd really like to do this evening is just tell you my story and share with you the hope that I have found through Jesus Christ and through faith, and also help understand the wounds and the damage that have been caused. And understanding the wounds is really important. For those of you who are survivors, I want you to know that you're not crazy. You're not being overdramatic. You're not making this up. This is not your fault. This is real damage. And sometimes when you can understand that better, it helps you be released from some of that false guilt. And it also gives you some knowledge for what healing can look like moving forward. And for those of you who are wanting to work with survivors and walk alongside them well, the more knowledge that you have as to what trauma does to us, the better you can walk alongside with knowledge. And I also want to look at the damage because a lot of times in my work, I am also working with those who have been abusers. And they're struggling with what comes next for them. But forgiveness and hope is not found in shutting away what you have done, but in understanding it and acknowledging it so that you can have the knowledge to move forward and to do it better the next time. And facing sexual assault is not an easy task. The statistics alone are staggering. 1 in 4 girls by the time they reach adulthood, 1 in 6 boys. The numbers actually go up for women in the college age bracket. In the 18 to 24 age range, it's actually over 1 in 4. When you add domestic violence in there, we're looking at closer to 1 in 3. And how we respond to our own pain or how we care for those who have suffered is key, not just in healing, but in preventing a cycle of abuse. It is key for healing because what we know about sexual assault is that sexual assault survivors are 3 times more likely to suffer from clinical depression. They're 6 times more likely to suffer from post-traumatic stress disorder. In fact, the only category in our country that outpaces sexual assault survivors in PTSD diagnoses is combat veterans. Sexual assault survivors are 13 times more likely to abuse alcohol, 26 times more likely to abuse drugs, and 4 times more likely to contemplate or attempt suicide. Just as importantly, research has also shown us that the depth of the damage and the ability of a survivor to heal is definitively linked to the response they receive when they disclose their abuse. The depth of the damage and the ability of a survivor to heal is directly linked to the response they receive when they disclose their abuse. So for those of you who are wondering, what do I have to bring to a survivor? Is there anything I can do? Yes. The power that you have to listen to those stories, to believe what you have heard, and to sit in the grief with them as they process what they have been through is incredibly powerful. And that's not just my anecdotes, that's actually backed up by some very solid research. There is a great deal you can do in a relational capacity to help survivors reach healing. And how we support them through healing is also vital in preventing abuse because approximately 1/3 of sexual offenders are actually juveniles themselves when they start abusing. And anywhere between 40 to 80%, depending on the study that you look at, of those juvenile offenders were first themselves victims of sexual abuse. So how we respond to our own suffering and how we walk alongside those who have suffered has a direct and clear impact in breaking cycles of abuse and trauma that are generationally sweeping through our culture. And I do understand these statistics personally because I became one when I was 7. I was sexually assaulted first in our local church. I was very fortunate that there was a group of adults who were trained sexual assault counselors who saw a lot of the warning signs, and they came to my parents and they said, "I think we have a problem." And my parents acted immediately to protect me, not knowing that anything had already happened. Adults who were trained to see the warning signs of abuse saved me from further abuse. But I also experienced the converse response in my church. When my parents took protective measures and put up healthy boundaries, the immediate response with the adults that were closest to me was, "You're making an accusation without foundation. If this is the way you're going to behave, we're not going around your children anymore." So by ages 8 and 9, I was reeling from sexual abuse that I didn't understand and couldn't verbalize, but I had also lost my entire community that up to that point had defined concepts of safety and faith for me. These adults I had been so close to. And when I started to understand in my early teen years what had happened and really grapple with why we lost our church and all those pieces fell into place, I absorbed my first lie. If you cannot prove your abuse, do not speak up because it will cost you everything. And when I was 15, I took that lie with me into the exam room of Larry Nasser. He was the team physician for our USA gymnastics team. I was not an Olympian. I was a club-level gymnast. I sucked, okay? I was never going to be anything good. Every once in a while I have people say, "Do you have any pictures of you doing gymnastics that we can put in our news?" No. There are no pictures left of me doing gymnastics. I had the privilege of doing an event once with Jordan Weber, the Olympian, and they're like, we've got these pictures of Jordan. Can you send us? No, not happening. So I was not an Olympian. That's not why I saw Larry, but Larry treated club level gymnasts from all over our state. And I thought it was a great privilege to get to go see the Olympic team physician. If this is who our Olympic team is trusted with, then this must be the best doctor ever, right? But he wasn't. And I became a statistic again. And Larry continued to sexually assault me under the guise of medical treatment for the next almost year and a half. And when I finally began grappling with the repeated sexual assaults and started to uncover the truth of what was actually being done to me, I was flooded with so many other lies that were just devastating. It was my fault. If I hadn't been so naive, if I had just trusted my own judgment, if I hadn't trusted him, if I had just fought back, if I hadn't frozen at the moment that I realized something was wrong, if I had just done something different, then I could have and should have stopped it. So it was my fault. And at the same time, I kept asking myself why I couldn't just get over it. I knew the statistics, but when I looked around, it didn't look to me like 1 in 4 women were struggling with the same kind of trauma I was struggling with. So now I was weak. I was being oversensitive. I was being dramatic. And I carried so much guilt, not just for my own abuse, but now I carried the guilt of not being able to heal from it. And I believed these lies. They played like broken records in my mind every night when I lay down to go to sleep, and they kept me from speaking out, and they kept me from the truth. Silence felt so much safer to me, because if I knew all these terrible things about me, and I told anybody, then they would know those terrible things about me too. So silence felt safer. But in reality, it kept me from hope and it kept me from healing. And for me, the first real crack in these lies came from a news report that I happened to see one night. I was supposed to be doing my math homework. I hated math, so I was not doing my math homework. I was watching the news and trying to pass that off as educational. It's current events, Mom. So I was watching the news, and the report was on a predator who was coming up to children in grocery stores and sexually assaulting them when their parents turned around to get something off of the store shelf. And somebody had finally seen it on a security tape. But when they went back and they reviewed security tapes from that store and from other stores, they discovered that this man had been serially sexually assaulting children right in front of their parents, just when they turned around. And not a single child had ever cried out or spoken up or fought back. And they brought in a child psychologist who started to explain trauma. And she explained a couple of things that were paradigm shifting for me. She explained that abusers often intentionally create situations where it seems impossible to abuse, like abusing very publicly or abusing in front of people. They do this on purpose because they know the confusion and the shock that it will create in the victim and in anyone who might witness it. They know those dynamics will cause anyone else who sees it or who hears that disclosure to say, that's not possible, abuse can't happen that way. It keeps the victim silent, and it helps ensure that the community who might be able to catch the abuser finds it implausible that abuse could have occurred the way the victim described it. Domestic abusers do the same thing, by the way. And second, the psychologist explained that a normal and common response to trauma is to actually freeze. We hear about fight or flight all of the time, right? But there's a third response, and that's to freeze. And it's when your body becomes so overwhelmed with the shock of what you're experiencing that it shuts down, and you can't move or cry out or fight back. Abusers know that about half of the victims experience this response, and they rely on that response in order to be able to abuse. It's also the case that abusers are very skilled manipulators, and they create dynamics and paradigms and frameworks that so shift reality and perception for survivors that they often begin lacking the framework to be able to articulate what they're experiencing. And I know this sounds crazy to those of us who grew up in normal, intact families, but if you think about the way a child's mind operates, or the way the framework operates for somebody who's been enmeshed in an abusive situation, can help you understand a little bit better. My brother, when he was growing up, he had a form of dyslexia, and we thought he was just really clumsy. He was running into walls all the time. It was just this standing joke in our house. Oh, there's Josh again running into the walls, right? And then one day he drew a family portrait when he was about 5 years old, and everybody's heads were on the left side of their shoulder. And at first my mom was like, oh, this is cute. You know, kids draw arms and legs sticking out of everything when they draw family portraits. But then she asked him, like, well, why'd you put everybody's heads on the left side? He goes, well, that's where everybody's heads are. His entire vision was shifted 6 inches to the left, which is why he was running into walls all the time. Okay? Mom's like, well, why didn't you tell me? Well, it was reality for him. He didn't know he needed to tell her that something was wrong because he didn't know something was wrong because this was reality. Okay, abusive dynamics are the same thing. When someone is in an abusive dynamic, their perception of what reality is, their perception of what normal is, their perception of what acceptable is completely shaped by what's around them. They don't know to verbalize to you that they're in an abusive dynamic. They can't verbalize to you they're in an abusive dynamic because that paradigm is so shifted for them. And that's where the community around them has so much power to be able to see what's going on and help give them the framework and the context and the words to understand what they're experiencing. Abusers are very skilled at manipulating the community, and it's on us as a community to help undo that manipulation. For those of you who are walking alongside survivors, understand that nearly all of them are going to carry massive guilt for not being able to stop their abuse, and also most likely be chronically second-guessing if their perception of that abuse is actually real. And the next thing I learned as I studied the dynamics of abuse and the effect that it has is that I wasn't actually alone in struggling to overcome it. Out of every crime committed on a victim who survives that crime, sexual assault has the farthest reaching consequences. And understanding this is really important because it helps us understand what life is like for a survivor and how to care well for them. And if you are a survivor, it helps give you the knowledge to understand what's happened to you and what you need to do going forward. So for just a little bit, I want to talk to you about the neurobiology of trauma. Because when you understand the injury, you can take better steps to healing it. So what do the wounds from sexual assault look like? Well, the answer is different for every individual, but there are some common threads to be aware of. First, the deep sense of shame or guilt. Often, this manifests in feeling the need to be punished or engaging in very self-harming or self-destructive or intentionally risk-taking behaviors. Part of the reason for this is often an attempt to regain control for the survivor. Victims will take partial or total blame for their abuse because subconsciously, if you can find something you can do different the next time, then maybe you can keep yourself safe. So when you hear someone describing the abuse that they've been through or what's going on, know that they are most likely going to be shifting the weight and the guilt and only giving you a little bit of the puzzle. They're going to take on responsibility for what's happened to them because it helps them feel safe, like maybe they can fix it the next time, maybe they can avoid it the next time. Oftentimes this looks like engaging in further sexually abusive relationships or physically abusive relationships. This can range from living in a cycle of abusive relationships to very sexually aggressive behavior. And there are two dynamics for this again. First, oftentimes survivors lack the ability to understand that what they're experiencing isn't healthy or normal. But it's also often an attempt to regain control. For a lot of survivors, if they can be the ones initiating the relationship, even if it's a very damaging and destructive relationship, it feels like they're in control of the situation. It's a way to try to wield their sexuality rather than having it chronically wielded against them, even if that means engaging in a cycle of continually abusive and destructive relationships. This looks like PTSD manifestations, anxiety and panic attacks and flashbacks. And the best way to understand that is to talk a little bit about how memories work. Do any of you guys ever see the Pixar movie Inside Out? Okay, where the little gremlins are going along in her brain and they pick up the memory marbles and they push them up the chute and you hear the gum jingle, the commercials. And that's Pixar's attempt to try to explain what it means when we say our memories have been jogged or my memory was triggered. Triggering is a real thing. Our memories get triggered all of the time because our neurology is always forming memories in connection to the sensory input that we have around us. And when we re-experience that sensory input, especially if it's a very strong neural connection, it will bring back with it these memories that we have. So, for example, I love the smell of pot roast. I know that sounds very funny, But I absolutely love the smell of pot roast because when I was growing up, we would often go to my grandma's house after church. And I grew up in Michigan, and the winters were freezing cold, so you walk out of this freezing, bitter cold wind into my grandma's kitchen, and she would have almost always cooked a pot roast. And so when I smell pot roast, I think about my grandma, and I can't help but smile. And I remember the smell of her house and the sound of her voice when she would turn around from the kitchen saying, "I'm so glad you made it." I remember how it felt to hug her, and I experience all of the emotions that I experience when I think about my grandma. My body releases serotonin and dopamine, and I feel very happy and at peace and calm when I think about my grandma, when I smell pot roast. Okay? And that happens automatically. I don't smell a pot roast and go, "Oh, your grandma cooked pot roast. Your grandma was a safe person. You loved her. Brain, I would like you to release serotonin and dopamine and make me feel better now." Okay? I don't tell my body to do that. My body automatically does that. That's how they're designed. Okay? And when we are forming connections and processes like that, we form them all the time. But research shows us that traumatic memories are stored and accessed differently in the brain. When a survivor experiences a traumatic memory resurfacing, entire regions of the brain that should be lighting up have actually completely shut down. The brain scan of a trauma survivor who is experiencing a flashback actually looks like the brain scan of a stroke victim. Regions that are processing or should be processing auditory input and verbal output are completely shut down. This helps us understand why a lot of times survivors who are triggered are not able to verbalize and articulate what they're experiencing, and also can't hear us very well to help them come out of that flashback. And then entire regions of the brain that should not be lighting up, like the frontal lobe that processes current input, is blaring when that traumatic memory gets re-triggered. And what that means is when a survivor experiences a traumatic memory being re-triggered, they don't usually experience it in 2D form. Now, I want you guys to think back to some sort of positive memory that you have. Take a minute and think about a positive memory you've got. And most likely, when you found that memory, you saw it playing in front of you, almost like you're watching a movie. And you might remember what you felt or what you heard or the sounds and the smells, and you might even feel emotionally engaged with that memory. But it's more like watching an emotionally engaging movie, okay? When a traumatic memory gets triggered, though, the survivor doesn't experience it in two-dimensional form. Instead, they experience it in three-body, full-dimensional form as if it's happening right now. That's why the frontal lobe is lit up so much. A survivor does not remember what they felt. They feel it again. They don't remember what they smelled or tasted. They smell it and they taste it again. And it is so disorienting that many times survivors will actually need help coming out of that traumatic memory and reorienting to the present. A lot of the survivors I work with will hold ice cubes or some other intensely cold object to try to reorient themselves to what's currently happening right now. Oftentimes they will need the help of a friend or a therapist to walk them through that memory and pull them back out of it. These flashbacks are incredibly traumatic events, and just like those memories of my grandma's pot roast cause a cascade of emotions and chemicals and realities, because my body was designed to do that, triggering a traumatic memory does the same thing. Survivors don't choose to experience flashbacks. They happen automatically and often without warning. These types of realities also cause cascading physical issues for survivors, a wide range of neurological and physical and medical realities because their bodies are constantly being flooded with the stress hormones, with the cortisol and the adrenaline. And sometimes it can help us to make correlations to our own experiences. Now, I've got 4 kids. They're currently ages 10, just turned 8, almost 7, and almost 4. And they are absolutely delightful. So delightful that they like to play this game called Let's Scare Mom. And if you've ever been around children, you know this is one of their favorite games. And it's where they hide behind a door or in a dark room, and I come in to put away the laundry, and they jump out and they yell at me. And it scares the daylights out of me. Okay, and you guys, I'm sure, have all experienced some form of being startled by a friend or a child where you weren't really in danger, but what did your body do even though you weren't? Okay, most likely you experienced a stress response. In the split second between my child jumping out at me and realizing that this is just my 10-year-old hiding in the closet again, my body goes into fight or flight mode. My heart will start racing, my skin will tingle, I might feel a little bit nauseous. I've got this on edge, jumpy, something's not right feeling, okay? That is the feeling that most survivors live in chronically. And most of them don't even know that they're living in it because that's been their reality forever. So we call this hypervigilance. And it's this feeling that something is chronically wrong all the time because their body is constantly being flooded with the stress hormones. Their brain doesn't shut them off anymore because nothing is safe. Now I want you to think of something that helps you feel better. Think of something that you do to calm yourself down or to de-stress. So I enjoy rock climbing when I get the chance to. Sometimes this might just be a hug from my husband or a friend. Okay, or holding one of my kids on my lap and reading them a book. Okay, and if I go up to my friend and say, hey, I need a hug right now, and my friend or my husband gives me a hug, I start to feel my body relax. Okay, I don't tell my brain, this is your husband, he's safe, he's giving you a hug, please release serotonin and dopamine and calm me down now. It's not something conscious I do. My neurobiology does that automatically because for the vast majority of my life, physical touch was safe. And so I have been able to rewire most of my neurology for physical touch from my husband to be safe. And my body does that automatically. But for a survivor, most of the time their body has stopped doing that. It doesn't respond anymore to the things that ought to be calming those stress hormones back down. So they don't get the serotonin and the dopamine and all of the things that should be calming our central nervous system back down. And when you don't get that, your body lives in a chronic state of fight or flight. And it has massive cascading realities. And these triggers can come from anywhere. It can be a smell, a sound, a sight, a word, anything that they experienced at the time of their trauma. Things that non-survivors won't give a second thought to can be terribly unsafe for a survivor. And a non-survivor's ability to self-regulate is oftentimes almost completely, if not completely, gone. Starting to understand the wounds from my abuse were really critical because most survivors will develop coping mechanisms in response to this kind of stress. Everything from explosive anger when they feel threatened to completely isolating or shutting down. Sometimes these will be practical measures like wearing a belt at night or tennis shoes to sleep to feel like they're ready to run at a moment's notice, or compulsively rearranging the furniture to block all of the windows and the doors, just so they can try to feel safe enough to sleep at night. Life in general looks very, very different for a survivor of trauma. And when you understand that and you can start to identify the lies that you have absorbed, and you can understand why your body is doing what you're doing, it helps you understand that the process of healing isn't weakness. Rather, it takes incredible strength. Now, oftentimes we think of trauma very differently from other injuries. But I often wonder what would happen if we treated trauma the same way that we treat physical injuries. You know, I had so much fun watching the Olympics with my kids this year. And one of the coolest parts is always seeing the backstory behind the athletes, right? And there's always a story of somebody who's come back from some kind of catastrophic injury. And they might have video of them at rehab and at physical therapy. And what do we do when we see those videos? Why do we tell those stories? Now, our response to that athlete is not, why did you need a team of medical experts anyways? Why did you need medication anyways? What's the point of a therapist? How are you so weak that you have to go to therapy 3 times a week? Why did you have to have limitations? That's not our response. We intrinsically know that the strongest thing that athlete could do is put in the incredible effort for healing. And that it showed amazing strength for them to show up day after day after day for recovery and in their therapy and to put in that hard work. And when we start to understand that trauma causes just as much actual real damage, we can start to understand that the work that is being put into recovery shows incredible strength. And so that was really powerful for me in my journey. But then there was another really important layer to my healing journey, and that was understanding where God was in all of this, in the midst of so much evil and suffering. Now, I had become a Christian years earlier. I had looked at the history and the science and the philosophy and had come to the conclusion that I believed this was true. But when I started having to grapple with my own abuse, and especially the church's response to it, it shook my faith to the core. I was very, very angry, but I was afraid to express that anger. I was reeling from so many questions, but I was afraid to express those questions. I was also in full out, I'm never talking about this mode, and you can't make me, so I'm not going to ask questions because I'm very stubborn like that. And at one point, my mom could tell I wasn't doing very well, and she told me, you have to deal with this. And if you don't deal with this, it will destroy you. And then she told me they were going to find a way to give me the time and space I needed to be able to heal. I was sharing a bedroom with my sister at the time, and I love my sister, but there is no privacy whatsoever when you're sharing a room with a preteen. So my parents actually moved my mattress downstairs, and they said, well, you at least have a door that closes. Okay? So here's your time and space. And I was really angry. I was very mad, and I said, hey, you're not going to do this, and you can't make me do this, and I'm not going to journal, and you can't make me journal, and if I do journal, I'm not going to write about what you want me to write about because you can't make me. I don't recommend the path that I took. I recommend getting in with a good therapist, doing it the right way, right away. But I didn't do that because I was very stubborn. But it was one of the best things that they could have done. And during that time, there was a quote by a famous author named C.S. Lewis that became really precious to me. Lewis wrote a book called Mere Christianity. And in this book, he is chronicling his journey from atheism to becoming a Christian. And he's wrestling in the beginning with the problem of evil and where is God in so much suffering. And he wrote, my argument against God was that the universe was so cruel and unjust. But where had I got this idea of just and unjust? A man does not call a line crooked unless he first has some idea of straight. What was I comparing the universe with when I called it unjust? And the biggest question I had as a survivor was, did God care? Does this matter to him? Did he see sexual abuse as something that was evil? I knew the damage that was done to me. But if God didn't care, then God wasn't safe, and I didn't want a God like that. And when I started to wrestle with this quote from Lewis, it made me realize something really foundational for me. The only way that I could know my abuse was unjust, crooked, is if there really is a right and wrong. A man cannot know a line is crooked unless he first has some idea of straight. I could feel the depth of the evil done to me, not in spite of God, but because of God. Just and unjust, right and wrong exist as opposites. And the more clearly we understand one of these, the better we will understand the other. But if there really is a right and wrong, and a good and an evil, I knew it had to come from something higher than me, and higher than any other human being. True good and evil, and just and unjust aren't matters of human opinion. If they were, then there was no metric for me to say, I unequivocally know that what happened to me was evil. And even the standards that we try to create for ourselves that are outside of ourselves, like, well, good is whatever society defines it as. Well, sometimes society defines some things that are really evil as being completely okay. And if you look at our societal response to sexual abuse, I knew I didn't want to be dependent on what society said about sexual abuse and sexual harassment. And sometimes we want to say, well, good is whatever is best for the most people. But then we're still appealing to a standard outside of ourselves to define what good is. And how many people do you have to have? And is there ever any way that you can do something and it does good things, but it's good for just enough people? You still have a standard outside yourself that you're appealing to. And I had to wrestle with the reality that the reason I could name my sexual abuse as evil, as crooked, is only if there is a straight line. And from this reality flowed several truths that were incredibly beautiful to me on my journey. First, if goodness exists, there is hope. As overwhelming as the grief and the suffering might be, it serves as a constant reminder that we can see and name the wrong only because there is a right. And when you can name and identify the goodness, there is hope. And it also meant that the truth could be spoken about the evil that was done without minimizing, without ignoring or downplaying the reality. I was no longer dependent on society's response or validation of what I had suffered. because truth was no longer dependent on society's response. I wasn't dependent on 12 members of a jury validating what I had experienced. I could name it and acknowledge it because evil does exist. And this allows you to grieve the damage even if others minimize or excuse what has happened to you. You do not bear the burden of proving it. You don't carry the guilt or the blame for it. And being able to grieve the damage in ways that are not destructive is foundational to healing. And then I also had to realize that if right and wrong exists, and it comes from something higher than me, then this God who has defined right and wrong cares about evil. The Bible teaches us that right and wrong don't flow from this random decision that God makes. I think this is bad and this is good. You like chocolate, I like vanilla. Right? That's not where right and wrong come from. It tells us it comes from the very goodness and holiness of God. And the reason that we feel evil so keenly is because it is such a departure from the pure love and holiness of the one who has defined right and wrong. The Bible tells us a lot about who God is, that he is safe, that we are to take refuge in him, that he is trustworthy and he is loving and he is good. Everything the Bible tells us about what God is the exact opposite of what happens in abuse. And because goodness and evil exist as opposites and in contrast to each other, the more you understand the one, the better you can understand the other. This also means that God is the ultimate source of goodness with no evil in him at all, can see the evil that was done to me even better than I can. And it is even uglier to him than it is to me. And some days, on the days that evil feels so overwhelming to me still, it has helped me to remember that I can feel the depth of that evil and I can see and I can name the darkness because God is the opposite of all of those things. Betrayal of trust is so wrong because God is so perfectly trustworthy, and that is what he has designed trustworthiness to be. Violation of a human being is so evil because God made us in his image. The destruction of safety does so much damage because God himself is so perfectly safe, and that's what he's intended safety to be. The misuse of strength and power is so wrong because God is so gentle and compassionate. And when we can name and grieve the darkness because God is the exact opposite of the evil that we have experienced, it gives us the straight line to prove how crooked the crooked really is. And where goodness exists, there is hope. I'm not going to lie, this didn't make everything magically better. It was still a very long road. I still had a lot of questions, but it gave me something to hold on to. And that also led me to the second question I had to ask. Where else am I going to go? This is there's a part in the Bible where Jesus has a lot of followers who are coming around him. And at one point in time, they decide, this is way too much for me. I'm going to walk away now. And Jesus turns to his disciples, he turns to Peter, and he said, do you want to go too? And Peter looks at him and he says, where else am I going to go? You have the words of life. And I had to wrestle with that question. If I erase God from the picture, I'm angry at God right now. If I erase him from the picture, does this solve my problem? And I had to wrestle with the reality that it didn't. Because if I erased God from the picture, I erased the straight line that gave me the ability to say what was done to me was evil and it matters. And so I was sitting on my couch one day and really just wrestling with all of these questions that I had, and I drew a circle, Venn diagram, because that's how I think. And I wrote in it everything that the Bible said was true about God. He is loving, he is trustworthy, he is safe, he is just. And I looked at that circle and I said, I don't have all the answers to all the questions right now. And I might not ever have all the answers to all the questions. But anything I believe is going to take an element of faith. And I do believe that the Bible is true. So whatever I don't understand, I know it can't contradict what the Bible says is true. There is nowhere else to go. And that was an anchor point. And then when I got that far, I had to start wrestling with the big question of forgiveness. If you guys have spent any time in recovery or in church programs, you know that forgiveness is a very big deal to Christians. And I was really, really angry about the idea of forgiveness because the way it was taught to me, I thought it was going to be, and oftentimes it is used as a way to minimize what happened. I knew that as soon as I said the words, "I forgive Larry," everybody would be, "Oh, what a beautiful testimony of faith." And they would want to skip right over all of the damage that I was still mired in. And a lot of times we treat forgiveness like it's just this balancing scale. If you just say the right words, if somebody who hurt you just says the right words or just does enough good things, you can outweigh it. Okay? I did this as a kid. You guys probably did too. There were times I would fight with my siblings and I would shove my brother or take a toy from my sister and they would start screaming at me. And then I would realize the amount of trouble that I could get in when my parents knew what I had done, and I would immediately start trying to fix that over, like, "I'll give you all my chocolate, you can have my pony, my Little Ponies, just don't tell Mom," right? And my kids do this all the time too. That's what kids do, just don't tell Mom. I'll do all these nice things for you, just keep it quiet. So when I catch my kids doing this, I say, "I'm really glad that you're trying to be nice, manipulative, but nice to your sister right now. But you giving her your candy does not fix the fact that her arm hurts because you pinched her." Okay? The pinch is still there, isn't it? You still did it, right? Because we know that forgiveness is not accessed by just doing enough other good things. But most of the time, that's how we teach it. But the Bible tells us that real forgiveness is rooted in a deep, abiding faith in God's justice. Unlike every other faith system out there, the Bible tells us that forgiveness isn't found in doing enough other good things that you've wiped away what else you've done. It's not found in saying the right words. It tells us that forgiveness is found in God's justice, in his offering to take the punishment that we deserve on himself. And that is the only way that forgiveness and justice can coexist, in a way that forgiveness is not used to minimize the damage that's done. God's love requires justice because the damage is real and it matters. But the Bible also tells us that God, in his love and mercy, gave himself to allow that justice to be poured out on him instead, to take the punishment and the justice for evil on himself to make forgiveness possible. Because evil is real and it matters, forgiveness does not mean that justice is erased. It means that someone else stood in that person's place. But justice is always done. It is only in the Christian faith that we have a God who unfailingly loves enough to always bring justice and also unfailingly loves enough to take that justice in our place. It is only in Christianity that I realized the abuse could never be outweighed by other good things that Larry did. Jesus Christ's sacrifice became so intensely beautiful to me during that time frame because it showed me two really critical things. It showed me how much God cared about what was done to me. It showed me how evil the abuse really truly was. That Larry's abuse of me was so evil that God demands justice for it. And that if someday Larry comes and says, "I am sorry," and really truly repents, God's not going to look at that and shrug his shoulders and go, "I guess it doesn't matter anymore," and wave his hand and make it magically all go away as if it never happened. God looks at what he did and says it was so evil that justice must be done. And then also says, "But I will take it in your place." The cross shows me that what was done to me matters. And it also shows the depth of God's love for me. Because that's the question survivors are always asking, right? Are you safe? Can I trust you? When we finally got to the sentencing hearing, after 16 years of looking for an opportunity to speak up, I finally had the chance to file a police report, and I was able to speak to journalists, and they made my sexual abuse an international headline, and it did what it needed to do. It caused hundreds of other survivors to come out of the woodwork, and eventually Larry pled guilty. After 18 months of very, very painful work, Larry pled guilty to sexually abusing me and a number of other women. And at his sentencing hearing, 156 survivors stood up over a 10-day period and described what Larry had done to them and gave victim impact statements. And watching Larry in the courtroom was horrifying, because as I sat there and watched him, he was sitting in the witness chair, and he had to be very heavily medicated because the stress of hearing so many women stand up and little girls stand up and describe what he had done was so heavy for him. Now, he still maintains to this day he didn't do it, but inside he knows who he is, and inside we all know who we really are, right? So he had to be very heavily medicated. He was this gaunt figure who could barely lift his eyes off the floor, could barely make it through the day. And I found myself wondering, during this time frame, that the media presence was very, very heavy, and so all of these impact statements were being broadcast literally all over the world. My in-laws happened to be at a rural fishing village in South America, and it was broadcast down there. It was the front page of their newspaper that day. And I wondered to myself, what if that was me sitting in that witness chair? If I had to sit in a courtroom and hear every mean thing I've ever said, every wrong thing I've ever done, every person I've ever hurt with my actions or my words or my attitudes, stand up and broadcast to the world who I am, how well would I do sitting in that chair? I'm not Larry, but I'm also not perfect. And it made me realize in a very fresh and new way how deep Jesus' love really is and what it means to be forgiven. And if Jesus' love is strong enough for Larry, it's strong enough for me too. And if it's that strong, then God can keep me safe. And he can hold me fast. See, in abuse, the idea of love gets so weaponized and manipulated and twisted. Abusers will say they love you and they'll do nice things, but it's just a tool to facilitate abuse. But if Jesus' love was so strong that he would sacrifice himself for someone like Larry, then his love was strong enough for me to trust. And unlike an abuser who uses and manipulates and wields their power for personal pleasure and personal gain, Jesus took that power and he sacrificed it for himself so that I could also experience forgiveness and to show how evil the wickedness in this world really is. And that is the opposite of everything I experienced with my abuser. It is an undoing of the abusive dynamic. The book of Revelation is one of my favorite places to turn when I am feeling just overwhelmed with the evil in the world. It's that last book of the Bible where God is telling that he is promising to come back and bring final justice. And it starts out with this visual picture, kind of like an allegory picture of Christ coming back, and it says he bears the sword of justice. And I needed that picture so much to remind me that what was done to me mattered to God and he was safe. But then it also tells us that Christ has promised to redeem those who have trusted in him. And it writes, there will be no more sorrow, neither suffering, neither will there be any more pain. For the old things are passed away. Behold, I am making all things new. God is holy and he cares about evil. And he is coming to bring justice. And for those of us who have suffered, that was an incredibly beautiful truth for me to hold to. And he is also tender and compassionate and lays down his power and his authority to make forgiveness possible, to take that justice on himself so that all things can be made new. So as you leave tonight, I hope that having an understanding of the damage that comes from abuse will help awaken you to the importance of walking alongside those who have suffered, and that it will also help drive us to ask some more of those ultimate questions. How do we know these things are wrong? Where do those standards come from? Is there hope? And if so, where do we find it? Because those are questions all of us have to wrestle with. Is there forgiveness for me? Where do I find that forgiveness and how is it obtained, and can I be sure? These ultimate life questions are things all of us have to wrestle with. And I really appreciate having the opportunity to share a part of my journey with you tonight. Should drag this.
I'm gonna set that right there.
All right.
We've really got this act put together.
It's coordinated.
Can we put my number up on the, there we go. Rachel, thank you so much. That's already trailed right there. So what we're going to do now is Q&A with Rachel. just some parameters for this. If somebody does ask a question, I would just like to guide us that we're not speculating about the backstory of why somebody's asking that question. People are free to ask a question, and no judgment about that. If it's a question that I don't know the answer to, or you don't know the answer to, then we'll turn to our friendly Google.
Sounds good.
I have questions that I could ask, but is there anybody, I'm going to pull my phone, I'm not just doing anything normal, I'm looking at my phone here. We have a mic if anybody has a question. Does anybody want to start us out?
I don't have a question. I just want to say thank you for your testimony. It's super powerful. I definitely don't find comfort in revelation. I think that's hilarious.
That's fair.
But I love that analogy. As a survivor of myself with trafficking and addiction and all these things, when I say forgiveness has a lot to do with healing, it's very controversial outside of the church, but in the church it's very understandable. And it just really makes sense how you're putting all of the neurology and forgiveness and just all that, like how it all comes together. But people who haven't experienced don't understand that. So I really give you a lot of credit and thank you for really, really digging deep and explaining it. So thank you.
Thank you. So my 10-year-old has to give presentations every week, and when he gets to the end, his classmates are supposed to ask questions, and if they don't have any, he goes, I must have done a really good job explaining all that. So he's got great self-confidence. I don't. I will feel much better if you ask questions.
Frankly. Yep. Can we turn that mic on? Thank you. Yep.
There we go. I want to first off thank you for coming forward and sharing your experience, strength, and hope with us. I do a lot of work with people in recovery, with the drug addiction and stuff like that. But I also run into people who've had the sexual trauma as well as other trauma.
Yeah.
And I know you came up with a bunch of statistics and stuff like that. One of the questions I did have is, you said that most of the people who do who abuse other people were products of abuse. And do you know what their addiction rates are as far as the people who do the abuse?
So there is a very high correlation, particularly with alcohol abuse. I'd have to look at the most recent data, but especially if you couple alcohol abuse with pornography and CSAM, you're looking at about 90 to 95%. Yep, substance abuse plays a massive role in those dynamics, and oftentimes it is a coping mechanism for those who have suffered trauma themselves.
I have a question. What would you say to people who are more not even struggling with like anger at the person that has perpetrated the act, like an act of violence or sexual abuse against them, but more angry at the institution that's protecting them?
That's actually really, really common, and I struggled with that myself very much. So I didn't have nearly as much anger at Larry as I had at God and at the institution surrounding him. And I think part of that reality is because when it's one person who's an abuser, that's one person. When you have an entire community and institution that has surrounded that abuser, now it's everybody who's unsafe. And there's an extent to which we can look at somebody who's an abuser and go, that's really abnormal. But then you look at everybody around them who are normal, and they don't care either. That level of betrayal is just so wildly, wildly damaging to all of us. And for me, the first step was being able to acknowledge that and to grieve it and to look at these institutions and say, that was wrong. And I'm not going to pretend it was okay. I'm not going to excuse or minimize or mitigate that what you did was wrong, and not asking the right questions and not doing the right investigations and not listening to the victims who came forward so many years before I did. I'm not going to pretend that that wasn't wrong. I'm going to call it what it was, and I'm going to talk about it very openly, and I'm going to grieve that. A lot of the grieving process has been at those who put all of us in that position who could have stopped it, not just at the abuser, and wrestling with that reality of the depth of betrayal in a community and a culture. That's very, very normal. I don't know any of us who haven't experienced that. And I think we need to be able to name it for the aberration and the evil that it is, and to be able to grieve that. I found it to be a very similar process in a lot of ways. Yeah.
Anybody else?
Thank you, Rachel.
We'll get to you. I didn't ignore you.
How does the church become better at being safe for victims to find grace and healing? I mean, this is obviously a big issue in your story,
Yeah.
and it's a big part of the church. So are there practical things, as a pastor, as elders, yeah.
I appreciate that very much. I think there are a couple of things. Becoming educated so that you can understand the dynamics of abuse and properly identify it is really, really critical. Most of the church abuse scandals that we have had have not been pastors who say, I think domestic violence and sexual abuse is great. I have no problem with it. I'm going to let it continue. Most of the time, it's been guys who say, of course we report domestic violence. Of course we report child sexual abuse. But they are so handicapped often by their theology in being able to actually see and identify abuse that when it's right in front of them, they still can't see it. And by the time they do, it's so many years down the road and so much damage has been done. So listening to people who can help you understand what a narcissist is, what an abuser looks like, what you need to do when someone discloses abuse or you're seeing warning signs, becoming educated so you can see what's in front of you is really important, especially in the domestic abuse context. So much of it gets categorized as, oh, that's just an unhealthy marriage. That's just overzealous parenting. No, that's child abuse and that's domestic abuse. But we miscategorize as, oh, those are just sin issues. And being able to tell the difference between a sin issue and abuse is really, really critical in being able to know what to report and to spot it and how to get someone to safety. So I do think education is really important. That does mean grappling with some of our theology sometimes. How do we define marriage and what should it look like and what is pastoral authority and what's our counseling ideology? Most of the time in the church when we get this wrong, we get it wrong because of our theology. So grappling with that theology is really important. There are some works by Diane Langberg that I really recommend from an education perspective, and I can give out some of those names later. But that's really the first thing. And then being very intentional about the care. So if you looked out at your congregation and you could say 25% of my congregation is suffering from cancer, or suffering from unemployment, or something that we're comfortable dealing with to an extent, you would probably have some level of intentional ministry to those people. It might be a meal train, so that they didn't have to worry about meals when they were going for medical treatment. It might be a group that can come and help clean their house. You might have a Bible study group or a grief support group. You would have some practical things that you would do in your church to be very intentionally ministering to that demographic, because 25% of your congregation are suffering from this thing, right? Well, when you look out in your congregation, 25% of your congregation, at minimum, are suffering from this thing. But survivors are really, really good at what we call flipping the switch, which is where you appear as normal as possible for as long as possible so that nobody knows you have a problem because you don't want them to know. So until they know you're a safe place, you're going to have no idea how many people in your congregation are suffering from that. The number of pastors that preached their first sermon on sexual or domestic violence thinking they had no one in their congregation and came back to me and said, I had 10 women come up to me after that sermon. All they had to do was preach one sermon. Creating spaces and intentionality for those ministries so that those people feel safe coming forward is incredibly important. And again, that does take some theological wrangling, because a lot of times when you're preaching through Scripture, you can wind up preaching on things like forgiveness or on marriage and things that you wouldn't necessarily think of as connected to abuse, but the way you're talking about it signals to a survivor they don't understand, and I can't talk to them about this. So really being aware of how our theology affects the practical outworking of pastoral care is really, really critical.
Rachel, how would you, taking that out of the Christian sphere and into so for example, like I think about the Hope Center here,
Yeah.
How can we be supporting and being on point so that, similar question, be a better place for folks who are in recovery, finding a safe place here? I imagine maybe just adjusting the theology terms that you're saying and just like how you think about, I don't know how you adjust that, but as a board member here, like there's not a theology document.
Right. Now, I think a lot of that is, again, it starts with training, being able to understand the dynamics, and I think that's something the Hope Center is probably already doing a lot of, from what I can see, understanding abuse and abusive dynamics and trauma signs so that you can spot those things where they're there. But the most powerful thing for a lot of us, and for me, was having somebody who could speak truth into the lies I was hearing. To help give a framework and a context for what I had experienced. For a lot of domestic abuse survivors in particular, this is really, really helpful because they don't, again, it's like that example with my brother, right? He didn't know he needed to tell my mom that everybody's heads were shifted 6 inches to the left because that was reality. Everybody's heads are shifted, like everybody sees what I see. This is normal. So when somebody is describing what they're experiencing, if you can know the categories and the framework to be able to help them see, actually, this is not normal behavior, this is not acceptable behavior, this is actually really damaging. We call this narcissism. We call this gaslighting. Here's what it looks like, to give them the tools and the framework to begin properly categorizing their experiences. That helps reorient them to what's real and what's true. And it's through that process that they begin to get the ability to say, I don't have to stay in this anymore. And to be able to see the warning signs and the red flags of danger in abusive relationships. And it is a really long process to reorient your understanding of what's normal. So be patient with that process. It takes a very long time, but someone who can speak the truth into those lies is incredibly helpful.
David, we had a question right up here.
I have a question. I was sexually abused for 9 years, and I turned to alcohol and drugs, and I'm in recovery now. And
That's awesome.
I've been sober off alcohol for 30 years, and I've been clean off drugs for 9 months. And I didn't have God in my life, and the pain got very, very deep, and I turned to God. But I have a question. How long does it take for a person to get over trauma?
That is a really good question. I think there are a couple of layers to that question. I think we don't always define healing properly. This is something I really wrestled with. When I came forward and I filed the police report, I was working with journalists and attorneys every single day. So I was just enmeshed in the details of my own abuse nonstop for 18 months. And that caused a lot of my trauma symptoms to re-trigger in ways that I hadn't experienced for the past 16 years. It had gotten to a point where it was largely a footnote in my life, okay, after a lot of work. And I was really, really angry about that. I was very angry because I wanted healing to mean that I never went back to that place. I wanted healing to mean that my triggers were gone forever, that I never felt hypervigilant, that I didn't have nightmares anymore. That's what I wanted it to mean, and it didn't mean that. And I really wrestled with that reality. And choosing to engage in advocacy work, it keeps it up there more than it was before. And that's just a choice that I've made, knowing the cost that's going to come with it. I think the best definition of healing is that you know what to do with the pain when it comes, not necessarily that the pain goes away completely. I do think that it does to a very large degree, and so I want to give that hope. There are a significant amount to which my trauma triggers are so much less than they were before. Nightmares are so much less than they were before. It does come. It does get better. But I also think if we define healing as we don't experience pain anymore, we become like we were before we were abused, it can put false guilt on us when we're not completely fixed, if that makes sense. And that was really hard for me. I had to kind of readjust my expectations for what healing meant and what it looked like. I think the best definition of healing is that we know what to do with the pain when it comes and how to grieve in ways that are non-destructive. It's been really important for me to start being able to identify those triggers again and to put up good boundaries. So I'm really intentional about taking time in nature to just give my body time to calm down. I've taken up rock climbing recently because I need something some days that is just going to burn the cortisol and the adrenaline and those stress hormones, just give me a way to burn it off. I schedule time to just be with people who feel safe. And knowing where those boundaries need to come has helped regulate better. But don't feel false pressure or false guilt or like you're not doing something right when you still have triggers or pain.
I've been carrying my pain for 55 years. And just recently, because of that, stuffing everything that I've gone through, I tried to commit suicide 5 times. And I have PTSD, bipolar, and borderline personality. And it's been very difficult for me. I have very bad nightmares and dreams, and I feel the presence of my abuser in my home, and it's very difficult to get through it. And I never believed in God because I grew up with a punishing God.
Yeah.
Because of the things that I've done with alcohol and drugs. And now that I'm sober and clean, I turn to God. I drop to my knees every morning, and I ask God, a power greater than myself, to keep me away from any issues in my life. And I drop to my knees at night, and it's been a very humbling experience for me, because I would never ask anybody for help. And my faith in God has gotten stronger the longer I'm dealing with what I need to deal with. You know, it's doesn't come easy. I live alone, and you know, I haven't gone back to church, and I believe that God has put me in the right direction to come back to church. I grew up a Catholic, and I'm a Christian. I got saved a few years ago, and I can't say enough for my higher power and what God has done for me in my life, because I was homeless for 5 years in Boston because of my addiction and the pain that I've gone through. And I'm just really grateful that I came tonight. Your presentation was just mind-blowing. It touched my heart, and I appreciate you immensely. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for sharing that. And in all sincerity, I am in awe of the strength that you are displaying. Thank you.
David, we had a question.
Thank you. Rachel, thank you so much for sharing your story. I'm a pastor, a foster parent. I've done some work in the anti-exploitation field. What is the best way to support people who aren't in that space to heal yet? You know, you shared a little bit about the anger of like being in that bedroom by yourself and not wanting to journal and not wanting to heal. How can we best walk alongside people when they're not ready to take those steps?
So the most powerful thing for me was having somebody who had a relationship with me, who could speak into my life. And for me, that was my mom and my dad. And my mom would just be real blunt sometimes. And I think there is, if you have the relationship to do this, building those bridges so that you can speak in is really helpful. My mom would just let me know, you're not doing well. I know you're not doing well. I love you way too much to let you hide. I'm not going to force you to do these things. I'm not going to take away your agency and your choice, but I want you to know that I'm here and that I am going to pursue you. And that was incredibly helpful for me because it gave me a safety net of knowing that I had somewhere to go, but it didn't strip me of my agency and my choice. So being able to have a relationship with a survivor where you can say those things, it's like, I am here. I am here for whatever you need. Yeah, these are the things that I can be here for. Sometimes giving some very concrete suggestions were helpful. My mom suggested that I journal because I wasn't willing to talk to anybody. And so that was really helpful. It gave, I was very stubborn. I was not going to do it, but I did do it anyways. And just knowing she was up there and she was going to follow up with me and she wasn't going to let me hide was to some degree some of the impetus for, I have to deal with this. She's not going to let me run away. Kind of thing. So sometimes giving very concrete suggestions can be helpful. It's been really helpful for my husband to just ask me questions. There's a lot that I won't verbalize unless he asks. And so even just knowing, we had a lot of those conversations when we were dating of just, what do I do in these moments? Do you need me to be silent? Do you need me to walk away? Do you need me to ask questions? Being able to have those discussions in a non-triggered environment so that some sort of action plan can be formed can be really helpful. It gives the survivor time to think through what's actually going to be helpful for them. And for me, I realized that if he didn't ask questions, I would just shut down. I needed him to stay there. I needed him to ask questions and to sit with me until I could answer them so that I could process what was going on. But I really suggest having those questions, obviously in a relational context and in a non-triggered state so that you can form some level of action plan.
Real quick, I got a text question in. Rachel, you talked, I'm just going to read the question.
Go for it.
So, rather than trying to reframe it. You talk about grief as if it is a healing experience. Can you go into detail about what grieving looks like for you and why it is healing? That's a great question.
So for me, there are a couple levels. First, I think if you don't grieve what you have experienced, you're probably bottling it up. The only way that we can't be bothered by abuse is if we pretend it's not happening, and that only works for so long, right? If you have an injury and you cover it with a Band-Aid, you can make it look nice for a little bit, but it's still festering down there. You have to treat it, right? So until I grieved, the reason I wasn't grieving was because I was bottling it all up. I'm fine. I'm not going to talk about it. Nobody's ever going to know. I'm fine. Close the door. And that was a coping mechanism to try to make myself feel safer. But it doesn't actually fix the problem. Once you start allowing yourself to recognize what you've been through and the damage that's been done, anger and grief are natural and right emotional responses to those things. If we're not grieving something that's really terrible, it's probably because we're not letting ourselves feel it. So grieving took a lot of different forms for me. I did start with journaling to a degree. I found a lot of comfort to an extent in the Psalms, especially the Psalms where David was crying out to God, "Where are you?" And there were a lot of times that I didn't have the words myself. I was just so exhausted. I couldn't find the words. So I would read some of the Psalms and I would write them back. I would journal them, but I would make them first person because that at least gave me some sort of framework for beginning to express something. For some survivors that I work with, music is really powerful for them, so they will turn on songs that reflect their heart's cry and what they're feeling and experiencing and allow themselves to grieve through that. Art can be really helpful. I did do some drawing. I suck at drawing, but it was a good outlet. And so I drew sometimes to try to give some level of expression to what I was feeling. Being able to identify what you're feeling gives you the framework and the words to begin grieving it. Grieving is a very messy process. I don't want to paint the picture that you cry for a little bit and then you feel fantastic afterwards, because that's not how it works. But I did also find that a lot of times when I was very angry or having a lot of trauma responses, it was because I was bottling things and I wasn't allowing myself to grieve. For me, unhealthy anger was the flip side of not letting myself grieve. And so being able to, as funny as it sounds, set aside time to be able to sit down and process what I had experienced, to look at the damage that was done and to acknowledge it and name it, was not a process I wanted to go through because nobody wants to be broken. I would have much rather been able to say, I am fine, there is nothing wrong here. But if you look at the damage that's been done and you name it, that gives you the ability to identify the lies that you're hearing and why you're responding the ways that you're responding, and to grieve the very legitimate damage that's been done. And then that quote by C.S. Lewis has also been really helpful to me in the grieving process because it reminds me, I can and should grieve the depth of the evil. If I don't feel like this is evil, it's because there's something wrong with my moral compass, right? I can see and name the darkness. But it also was a very tangible reminder that I can see and name the depth of the evil because God's goodness exists in such utter contrast to that. And to choose to know that the hope and the goodness is still there in the grieving process. It freed me from the guilt of, I'm being over dramatic, this really isn't that big of a deal, why can't you get over it? And then it also allowed me to realize that there is hope and I can name the evil because the good does exist. And sometimes it's choosing which direction to look. There were days, especially when you're parenting 4 kids, you don't have the time to just shut yourself in your room and be like, I'm sorry, children, you do not need to eat today because mommy has to go grieve, right? You don't have that option. And so sometimes it was being very intentional to look for the beautiful things. So I would sometimes take my kids on a walk. I was like, do you hear the birds? Do you see that beautiful flower? Do you feel the warmth of the sun? And I would talk to them about the beautiful things we were experiencing because I needed to focus my mind there, while knowing that at some point in the very near future, I'm going to have to schedule some time to pull away and to be by myself. And I have the benefit of a husband who can help take care of the kids for a while, so that I have that. But that is also another way that churches can really help survivors in that process, especially moms or parents who are walking through trauma, to be able to take the kids for a little bit so that the parents have time to grieve and to process together is really, really helpful.
So, how as a child, can I help other children who might be experiencing?
Yeah, that's awesome. I think a lot of the things that we've done today, you absolutely have the power to do, to build those relationships, to know what abusive signs look like and what trauma signs look like in your friends, and to be that person who says, hey, I'm concerned about you. Is everything okay? Do you need someone to talk to? I did start selectively sharing my own story with people that I suspected had come from trauma long before I ever spoke up, because it gave them an open door that I had a connection point with them. I would understand what they were experiencing. I think the power of social media is actually something that we can really harness for a lot of good, because survivors are always looking to see who's safe, right? So they look at how we talk about trauma. They look at how we talk about abuse. And if they see someone who's posting on social media and they're talking about abuse or things that have come up, and they're saying, hey, if this is you, like, you can come talk to me, or we need to stand against a culture of abuse, they're talking about those things, that helps survivors be able to say, okay, that person might understand what I've been through. This might be somebody safe to talk to. So how you signal your safety is actually really, really powerful. And it also helps change the tone of the conversation, right? Because it's all of us talking about these things that help change the culture and the community around abuse. And so even how you talk about it to your friends can be incredibly powerful.
I got a couple. Sorry.
He has some text questions he's going to read now.
Yes. Thank you.
Welcome.
I got tripped up. How do I acknowledge and respect people? And I got a text from people. So you talked about victims continuing to choose to stay involved in or repeat or continue in abusive situations. What encouragement or guidance would you give to someone walking alongside an individual who continues within the cycle of either unable to see it or just too comfortable with it to break away? How much do you listen? How much do you speak into that dynamic?
Yeah. So I think that is a little bit of individual for the situation, because every situation is different, and some survivors need much more blunt talk, and some are at the stage where they need much more gentle leading. Okay, so again, developing relationships is really, really critical, because it will help give you a picture of where this person is at. Are you going to scare them off with blunt talk and cause them to shut down, where you need to take a much more gentle approach? Or are they at the point where they really need someone to say, look, this is not okay. You are in trouble. You need to get out. Can I please get you to this shelter? But there are a couple of things to be aware of. It has to be the choice of the survivor. As hard as that is, you cannot strip them of their agency and their choice. So putting those safety nets in place and making sure that they know those safety nets are there and that you love them and that you will help them get there is really, really important. But it has to be internally motivated for them. You cannot make that choice for them. And I know that's a really difficult place to be, especially if you are just starting to discuss some of these dynamics with someone, listening to what they're experiencing, and listening with grief, listening with the ability to articulate back to them, that's not okay. I'm so sorry that you have experienced that. This is a little bit of a fine line to walk, okay? Because a lot of survivors who have experienced abuse, if you come out, as much as you might feel internal rage at what they have experienced, it will scare them if you show that, because anger is unsafe. And they're often trying to protect the person who's abusing them because they've shifted the blame onto themselves. So you need to mirror their emotion to a point, show that this is not okay. I'm so sorry you have experienced this. This is not normal. Help start putting a little bit of paradigm and framework to it, but you cannot show the emotional load that you're feeling. in that moment without potentially causing them to shut down or causing a trauma or a triggered response. So beginning to engage with them and beginning to help shift that paradigm a little bit and give them some words to articulate what they're experiencing, and then helping create that safety net so that they know they have a place to go is really, really important. But the harsh reality is you can't make that choice for them.
Another question, then I'll get to you. Okay. What would you recommend? What would your recommendation be for close friends to support survivors who are early in their healing? And in a similar vein, I guess is the second question: how can friends support survivors who may have suppressed memories of their trauma?
Yeah. So
Does that track?
yeah, yeah. So in terms of friendship, again, building those relationships and being that listening ear, being able to be a safe place for them to talk, being able to speak the truth into the lies that they're probably hearing, being able to articulate, this was not your fault. I'm so sorry that that happened to you. That was not okay. Being able to ask the questions of how can I help you? Looking for very practical things that can be done, encouraging them to get into therapy. Hey, can I help you would it help you if I made some calls to a therapist? Would it help you if I brought a meal over to your house on the days that you have therapy so you're not struggling to feed your kids at the same time you're coming out of, this therapy appointment? Looking for some of those very practical things that can be done. Suppressed memories are really hard. You do run a risk of really messing with memory and with healing if you are taking on that role. Recovering memories has to be done very carefully, including, this is me speaking as an attorney, if there's any chance that criminal charges will be filed, you've got to be real, real careful. I do not ever recommend helping someone unearth memories. You can connect them with a very good trauma therapist who can do that and be there in that support role. I've got some friends who will go to therapy appointments with their friends so that they can be there with them. Or if they are, say going through some group therapy, or they feel the need to go back and revisit a childhood home or a location where something happened, to be the support person there can be really helpful. But any kind of memory recovery really does need to be done by a skilled and trained trauma therapist. And you can help on that journey, but the actual memory recovery really should be done by a trained trauma therapist.
That sort of just kind of changed what I was going to ask you. But thank you, Rachel, for speaking. I wanted to suggest that, and it's about helping people in the end, is I feel like what I went through in my own life many years ago, I feel like God has given me the opportunity that I could help somebody because I've experienced what somebody else is going through. So my suggestion would be, I know you're saying it should be a trained person, but perhaps if there's somebody in your congregation who has been through something, they could go to the pastor and say, just so you know, I've been through this, God's helped me through it, I'm on the other side. But if anybody ever comes and they feel like they need somebody, I would be willing to talk. And I don't know if that seems like a good idea as a first step for somebody before they can get to some other trained therapist. And would it be helpful? Somebody in the church could be a blessing like that.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, so I want to clarify, when I say like the memory recovery part should be done by a trained therapist, the process of sitting down and letting those memories resurface, dealing with dissociative identity disorder or split personalities, that really does require trained trauma care. But that relational capacity that you're talking about is so, so critical, because you've got to have a support network that surrounds you that can help you even get to that point of being able to identify what you've been through and to name it, and to be in a position where you feel safe enough to meet with a therapist. And so I think it's absolutely phenomenal and fantastic to have someone in that capacity. Yes.
Rachel, a couple questions have come in along these lines, so I'm going to make it a gender-neutral question.
That's fair.
What advice would you give to someone whose spouse their spouse is a survivor and they're trying to figure out how to best support them? especially if like the abuse that happened didn't come out until years after their relationship. So to make it even more general, spouse or significant partner, just to kind of be as inclusive as possible with that question. And I understand that I'm not asking you to reveal all the details of how you and Jacob do your relationship, but just advice in general on that.
Yeah. So there were a couple of things that Jacob did that was really helpful for me. And I did disclose to him very early because I knew I can't be fighting the lies in my own head and the person that I'm dating at the same time. And so we did talk about it really early, and I'm grateful for that. But one of the most powerful things he did was he knew the lies that I would be hearing in my own head, and he combated them for me. This was not your fault. I am so sorry that this happened. I don't see you any differently. I want to walk with you on this path. It doesn't matter how long it takes. And to really orient himself to what trauma looks like and to minister to me specifically, to be able to be the constant input of truth to me was really helpful. We did have a lot of open discussions, and if you can have these, I really encourage it in non-triggered times to say, when this happens, can you explain to me what's happening? Can you explain to me what's going to be most helpful? What can I do to support you? A lot of couples that I know do go to therapy. We were kind of beyond that point by the time he and I met, and I was in a really good place. I never did see a trauma therapist. I do not recommend doing it the way I did it. I just didn't have access to them. Okay, so if you cannot do what I did, don't do what I did. But a lot of, I know, do what I say, not what I do.
Whatever that means.
Don't do what I did. But sometimes getting your spouse or your significant other, if they're willing to go to a good trauma therapist, sometimes that trauma therapist can bring the spouse in so that they can be part of some of those sessions and they can start working through some of those issues. Sometimes it feels safer to a survivor to have a third party. In that context, you can start asking some of those questions. What do I do? How do I do it? What would be most helpful for you? And to kind of translate the trauma language for the person who hasn't experienced that. So getting some outside help can be really helpful, and knowing what's going to be best for you. For some trauma survivors, they need to pull back completely and to be by themselves so that they can come out of those triggers. For me, I found it was the exact opposite. I needed Jacob to be with me, and as much as that would sometimes feel threatening, I needed to be able to push through that and rewire the neurologic associations with all of those things. And so it was actually better for us to not have him go away. And so being able to just think through some of those dynamics, how do I reassociate his presence? How do I reassociate physical touch? How do I rewire my neurology to all of these different things? And to almost plan ththose things, as funny as that sounds, but to have an action plan in place so that you are understanding what's happening with your significant other, and you've also talked through what helps and doesn't help. And being able to do that in a non-triggered environment so that you can really have a good discussion. And oftentimes bringing in somebody who is a trained trauma therapist can help navigate those dynamics if it's becoming difficult for you to do it on your own.
I have more text questions. Am I okay with you guys? Cool. It's 8:30. Are you guys down to keep going with these questions?
If somebody needs to walk out to you, I'm not going to take it personally.
Okay. I'm very kind of whatever. When abuse occurs in a family system, how can I best help family members understand my trauma, and how do I know how to set boundaries and identify safe people outside of that?
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
It does. I wish there was a really easy answer to that one. Abuse in a family context is really, really difficult because most of the time, in my experience, the family members are not particularly supportive of the survivor. They don't understand the depth of the trauma, they don't understand why it's such a big deal, and it becomes this constant infighting, almost. I think the first thing I would say is it is not necessarily your job as a trauma survivor to have to educate your family. If that is something that you feel like you can do and you feel safe doing it and the door is open for that, then that's fantastic to be able to have those conversations. But for a lot of trauma survivors, it's really not safe. Or they can only go so far before it becomes unsafe. And so I do think it is really important to know where healthy boundaries are. And sometimes that requires grieving the loss of the relationship that you should have been able to have with your family. And I wish that wasn't the outcome a lot of times, but a lot of times it is. And I have walked through this with close friends and family. I was very fortunate to not experience that myself, but my mom did. And a lot of my in-laws and close family members have. And part of that process, I do think, is being able to grieve the loss and to be able to recognize that I can only have a relationship to this point, or I actually can't have a relationship at all. This person is not safe for me, and to be able to go through the grieving process of that loss too, because it is a significant loss. But sometimes that loss has to be recognized and healthy boundaries have to be put up. So being able to really think through where those boundaries might need to be and how far you can go, and whether or not those conversations are actually being effective and there's restoration happening. I know I keep bringing up the idea of a therapist, but in actuality, oftentimes when you have family members that do not understand trauma, having a third party who does, who can come in and help explain to them and translate for them, at least take some of the burden off of you of having to continually educate and advocate for yourself, and in the family context where you ought to be the safest. And so if you have family members who genuinely want to learn and they are just not getting it, sometimes if you have the resources, bringing in a trauma therapist or going to family therapy can help navigate that dynamic. And the other part I forgot. You want to read that part again? There was a second part to that question that was also very good.
And how do I know how to set boundaries and identify safe people outside of that? Is that the second part?
That's the second part. Thank you. I knew it was a good question. Again, I wish there was a very easy answer to this. For the most part, I tend, well, I don't really have a choice now. Everybody knows my story. But before everybody knew my story, I kind of hedged around some of those issues by watching how people talked about these things. How are they talking about abuse? How are they talking about power dynamics? How are they talking in the church context about these theologies that affect abuse and power dynamics? Because that's what they would understand if I came forward. That's what they would really think of me. And so I spent a lot of time people watching and just listening to see how they talked about it. Sometimes when we were looking for another church after getting the boot out of our first one, my husband and I really shifted how we asked questions. So when we were having conversations with people, we would ask questions about current events that related to abuse, or about books that we were reading, or we would bring up a particular situation that was in the media or something, and just kind of gauge their response to that, because that would help us know if this person was someone who was safe to bridge that gap with.
I've got more questions.
Go for it.
I have all the questions. Is there a point where one should just stop pushing the truth and just give up that their church or community is just not going to get it? Is this a kind of like shake the dust off your feet type of situation, or one where we are required to stay and push for the sake of those victims that might follow, especially if the abuser is a church leader?
Right.
So I guess, how long do you stick it out, right?
Right. Usually we stick it out way longer than we probably should, and way longer than is actually effective. And here's why. Most of the time, the best thing that you can do, now I'm not saying you make this decision right away, I think you make very wise appeals. I think you make very godly appeals, very well documented appeals. And then you see how the leadership responds and whether or not they have a heart to learn. And if you know what you're looking for, you can figure it out pretty fast. Like a month to 2 months, you can probably figure it out if you understand how narcissists operate and you understand what unhealthy dynamics look like and what healthy dynamics should look like. So yes, you make those appeals. The best outcome for everybody is always that we learn and grow together, right? And that communities learn and grow together and they do better. And that's what's best for victims. That's what's best for the community. That's what's best for those in leadership. A lot of times we don't get there. And so if you are dealing with a situation where there are people in authority who are dangerous people, and I don't mean just sexual abusers, I mean spiritual abusers, people who are sheltering abusers, who are doing damage to survivors by keeping them in abusive situations or not properly reporting abuse. If you have people in leadership who are abusive, the safest and best thing you can do for survivors is to blow the whistle on what's going on. to bring light into that darkness. And this is not done because you're bitter and angry and you hate the church or you hate the community. It is done because you love that community and you know the absolute best thing for that community is for the truth to be told. And as much as we talk about, especially in the church, how great unity is, yes, it's a biblical concept, but unity around the wrong thing is sin. And if we are unifying around abusive leadership and we are unifying around abusive dynamics and abusive theology, we are in sin. And it is not godly to keep unity when you are unifying around something that is sinful and damaging people. And sometimes the best thing we can do is to bring that light into the darkness. And it is a painful process, but that is the process that the abusive leadership has chosen. And I think that's part of the importance of being able to properly understand who has responsibility here. I always tell my kids, look, there are two reasons you can choose to do what's right. You can choose to do what's right out of fear of the consequences. You don't want the negative repercussions of having done this bad thing. You don't want time out. You don't want to lose your privileges. And that'll work for a little while. But it's only going to work until you feel like the consequences can be removed. And as soon as you think you can get away with it and you can remove those consequences, your internal motivation to do the right thing is gone. But the other reason you can choose to do what's right is because you love the people around you. And I want nothing more than for our communities and our churches to be at a place where they do the right thing because they actually genuinely really love the people around them, more than they love their own power and their own authority and what it gets them. But most of the time, a lot of the time, we're not there. And so if you reach a point in a community where you cannot make any headway and you have to bring the darkness into the light, it is not your fault for having to do that. That leadership has chosen the negative consequences. If my children choose not to be motivated by love, I'm not the bad guy for giving them a timeout. They chose that timeout. Their choices led them there. And if that's the path that abusive leadership in the church or in any community takes, the responsibility and the guilt and the shame for having to divide and bring that darkness into the light, that is on the abusive leadership who chose the negative consequences and chose not to be motivated by love and care for the people around them. That is not your fault.
Rachel, real quick, one term that we keep using is narcissism. Could you just give a brief definition of what that means, in case there's somebody here who doesn't understand what that word means? I know that we use it kind of like generally, but like, give us a definition.
Okay, so this is a not clinical definition because I am not a psychologist, but a narcissist is hallmarked by a lack of empathy. They do not emotionally relate or care about what other people are experiencing. They're often hallmarked by being incredibly skilled manipulators. They're generally very gregarious people. They're able to put on a persona and a front to manipulate the community around them. Who you see in front is not who you see behind. And these patterns of behavior are not one-time events, they're consistent patterns of behavior. It's a consistent pattern of not having an emotional attachment or caring about what you're doing to people, even though you can put on a really good front to make it look like you do. It's a consistent pattern of manipulation. It's a consistent pattern of putting on a persona that does not match your actions behind the scenes and being completely self-absorbed in your own correctness and in your own rightness. It's always somebody else's fault. There's always a but. There's never a period after the I'm sorry. Does that work?
Brief, great. You said forgiveness does not minimize the damage done to you. Could you expound on the definition, especially in a biblical sense? What does forgiveness in itself mean, especially when someone is a victim of sexual abuse? People often revert to the verse that God tells us to forgive, and then we need to let it go, and it's not for us to deal with. And if you forgive, how did you? So
Okay.
that's sort of.
So I think that second part, that it's not for us to deal with, I think that's the key right there. That's the difference between justice and forgiveness. Justice is conformity to an absolute standard. That standard doesn't change no matter what Larry ever says or does, or how much he does or doesn't repent, or the other good things he says or does. The standard of what he did wrong when he sexually abused me is still there always. Forgiveness is not a diminishment of justice. Forgiveness is a choice to release my personal desire for vengeance, to do to somebody else what was done to me, to do to my abuser what he did to me. It is a personal decision. Now, why can I make that personal decision? In every other faith context, I make that personal decision based just on I'm choosing to let go, then what? In Christianity, the reason that we can let go of personal vengeance is because we have a God who can be trusted to always bring justice. Justice is always, always done in the Christian faith. So when I was wrestling with the concept of forgiveness, my biggest frustration was knowing that if I got to the point of saying, I forgive Larry, most Christians were going to trot that out very quickly and go, oh, what a beautiful story of redemption. And in fact, that is exactly what they did. I did offer forgiveness to Larry in my victim impact statement. By the time we got there, like I said, there were 156 women. I had spent 18 months of just exhausting, continuous labor. Every judge I had been in front of, I begged them to give him the harshest possible sentence because he was a danger to others. And if he did not recognize that, I was not loving him well either. The best thing for everyone was for justice to be done. So I spent, and Larry would come in. He used to teach Sunday school, and he would bring his Bible to court. Whenever we had court hearings, he would bring his Bible to court, and he talked about how he prayed for us, and he really tried to put a lot of religious verbiage over what he had done, okay? And I did not want him to be able to manipulate my Redeemer that way. So when I gave my impact statement, I spent a considerable amount of time delving into the reality of God's justice and his wrath against sin, and I called him out and said, you brought your Bible to court, but if you've read it, you know that this is what it says, okay? And then I said, this is how forgiveness is achieved. And I shared the gospel with him, and I said, and you need that far more than you need forgiveness from me, but I offer that to you as well. Every single Christian outlet, every single one of them, timestamped my impact statement at the I offer you forgiveness and bypassed 30 minutes of discussing God's justice, which was the entire foundation for why I had forgiven Larry. I could release personal vengeance against him because I had a God who could be trusted to bring justice. And forgiveness also meant, I think in the Christian context, that I would desire for Larry to receive God's forgiveness, that I genuinely desire his repentance, and I do. He is such a pitiful, broken man who has cut himself off from all of the incredible, beautiful things he could have experienced in his life choices. I pity him. And I want him to experience God's forgiveness. So when I am releasing personal vengeance, when I am forgiving him, it is a release of my personal desire to harm him and my desire to exact vengeance because God will do it. And if Larry does ever repent, it is not like God waves his hand and goes, oh, well, I guess it doesn't matter anymore. No, then God's Son comes. And he is nailed to the cross and stripped and beaten and takes that justice on himself. The justice is always done in the Christian faith. And the reason that we can forgive is because we have a God who will always bring justice.
Sorry, I keep missing.
As a survivor of sexual abuse in a family setting, how would I find constructive outlets for being myself in a safe place?
Yeah, it's a great question. I'm really sorry. And especially when it happens in the family context, it really rocks your sense of identity and who you are. For me, it was really important to look at what I enjoyed and the gifts that I had, and then look for outlets there. So I'm not a musical person, so music was not my thing. My sister is a very musical person, so for her, playing piano and music that would express her emotion was really important. So she really engaged in a lot of music classes. My sister's not a survivor of sexual abuse, just to be clear, but she does have just some other trauma from gymnastics and things like that. So when she was really trying to find her identity and who she was, she looked at her giftings and her abilities and what brought her comfort and what brought her fulfillment, and really found ways to express those things. For me, it was writing. Writing was a really helpful way for me to begin expressing what I had experienced. And so I did a lot of journaling. I did some drawing. I also have been really intentional at finding some level of physical outlet. I've been able to figure out that my body works best when I have something that takes a lot of mental energy and also physical energy. So gymnastics was a great outlet for me because it's both mental and physical. Baseball and soccer are very physical, and I sucked. So those were not coping mechanisms or outlets that I pursued. But rock climbing is. Like, rock climbing is very mental and it's physical, and it gives me something to focus on, but it also really burns energy to help burn some of those stress hormones that I'm experiencing sometimes. And so knowing that about myself kind of helped guide where I can look. Finding friends and safe people who I can express those things to, that can be really hard. I'm going to be honest, we haven't found a lot of that since losing our church 6 years ago, and especially doing a lot of work in the evangelical community. It's been really hard to find good community and good safe people that we can express those things to. But I actually took time to sit down and just honestly think through, like, how does my brain work? How does my body work? How do I process things? What's going to be most helpful for me? For me, knowledge was really important, understanding why my body was doing what it was doing. So I took time to listen to YouTube videos and read books on the neurobiology of trauma because it helped me understand what was happening, and then that gave me some tools for processing. So knowing how I work physically and mentally helped kind of guide how I express those things, and also helped try to find some safe people and safe communities that I could express those things in.
I have no more questions on the text. Do you want to be done with the question Q&A?
I mean, if people have more questions, I'm happy to hang out, and you guys have also been incredibly patient, so.
Okay, here's what we're going to do. It's almost 9 o'clock. Let me just offer a few more thoughts here, and then we'll move things along. Can we go to the next slide real quick, just for some resources? On the back table, you'll see those huge stacks of books. These are the books that are up there, or are in the back. Rachel's written a few of these books. Your main book, What Is a Girl Worth, is, I got all the books that I could in the country. Like, it's out of print. So those are the last ones. Actually, they're coming out in paperback. Your children's books for How Much Is a Little Girl Worth and How Much Is a Little Boy Worth. And we have several of those. I would encourage you to take one of those books, even though they are children's books, because they are accessible books with powerful truths, and you get to see beautiful pictures in it. Like, don't feel embarrassed as an adult or somebody who's not 5 reading a book that's written for children. It's accessible, it's helpful, it's simple. They're incredibly beautiful books and very helpful for us. Just a few of the other books back there. Jasmine, The Diary of Jasmine Grace. She spoke earlier in the Q&A. The Body Keeps the Score. There's 5 copies of that. Again, please take those. That kind of goes into the neurobiology of the stuff that you were talking about in the first half of your talk. Rid of My Disgrace, Hope and Healing for Victims of Sexual Assault, and Suffering and the Heart of God, How Trauma Destroys and Christ Restores. I understand those are both religious books, and if that's interesting to you, I would love for you to take them. If you're not interested in the religious dynamic, that's totally okay. The thing that I was grappling with trying to recommend those books is finding books that help survivors move forward. And I'm not aware of a lot of books in the non-religious space that do that. If you do know those books, please tell me. I would really be interested in those resources. Last thing I'll mention is folks from the YWCA are here. Can you guys raise your hand back there? They're the dream team from the YWCA. They have resources on the table. They're in the back. We've asked them to be here in case any of the things and dynamics of what we talked about tonight are triggering or difficult, or you're looking for next steps. They are here to equip you and to walk beside you in finding counselors, resources, those type, whatever those dynamics are, legal help with filing restraining orders against an abuser or something like that. They're here to support you. So please They do incredible work. I would encourage you to talk to them on your way out. Please grab a brochure and all that stuff. To reiterate, all of those books are free. I don't want to take them home. I want you to take them home. With that said, let me just offer this, and we're going to end with this note, okay? I'm going to read Psalm 23 for us as a prayer, and then we will close out the evening. Psalm 23 is in my Bible. Here it is. I think this is a word of comfort for us, whether we are survivors or whether we are friends to survivors, that the Lord is with us. The Lord is my shepherd. I shall not want. He makes me lie down in green pastures. He leads me beside still waters. He restores my soul. He leads me in paths of righteousness for his name's sake. Even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for you are with me. Your rod and your staff, they comfort me. You prepare a table before me in the presence of my enemies. You anoint my head with oil. My cup overflows. Surely goodness and mercy shall follow me all the days of my life, and I shall dwell in the house of the Lord forever. I hope that you guys have enjoyed the evening. Please stick around and talk. I'll be here. You're not here for me. Rachel will be here as long as you'd like to talk. Rachel, again, thank you for your time with us tonight. And thank you.